Seems that Gork is smiling down on the greenskins in Games Workshop's latest balance update. Let's talk about all of the massive points cuts for the Orks, and what's looking strong or weak after these big changes. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Orks, and in this video I thought we'd take a focused look at the greenskin faction and how the balance changes have affected them. Broadly speaking, Orks haven't had too bad a time of it compared with many in 10th edition. For their tournament win rate stats, they seem to be hovering somewhere around a 47-48% sort of area. That puts them around about the mid-tier or slightly north of that. And I feel like that's not really the worst place to be in, given that there's some absolutely terrifying threats out there, like Eldari, Genestealer, Cult, Custodians and Knights, all of which have been hit by heavy nerfs of one sort or another. Arguably I would have said that the faction maybe didn't have the best internal balance though. Basically all of the detachment and the faction rules really support Orks for getting into melee, definitely what they're most known for, but it is kind of a shame that most of their Daka units felt a little bit underpowered by comparison. Bar a few exceptions like flash kits and mech guns, most of the shooting units for the Orks just aren't that great. In the update, the Orks have done surprisingly well out of it. I feel like with other similar rated factions like Chaos Knights or Chaos Marines, a few more units perhaps got hits for the negative. But broadly speaking, the Orks' points decreases have been really quite wide-reaching, some of them even hitting things that were absolutely great already. There have been a few nerfs that I think really do take a couple of units kind of out of contention, but I'd say that overall the cumulative effect is that it's probably a positive for the greenskins, particularly in the faces that so many other factions have faced. Before the points, I'll just quickly mention the core rules changes, which to be honest I don't really think affect Orks all that much comparatively. They're maybe not massively big on devastating wounds. I guess occasionally some Squigosaur jaw attacks might kill slightly less infantry models than they would have done before, but I think that's not really going to be a big factor in whether they're strong or not. The free stratagem thing going to battle tactics doesn't really affect Orks as they don't get it in the first place, much more relevant for factions like Space Marines with so many options for captains. I guess probably the biggest changes for the faction are things like Overwatch not being able to be used on things like Gorkanauts, which I guess is somewhat relevant with their Deathstorm mega shooters. Overwatch is quite efficient on Orky units that hit on a 5+ originally, and insane bravery might occasionally mean that your mobs fail leadership. There's going to be less defense against that, but that's something that every single faction in the game has to contend with anyway. Getting into points changes though, and first up we'll start with the mobs and infantry. I say the single biggest boost in the index has been to Gretchen. They've gone down to 40 points for 45. This was perhaps one of the weirdest changes that Games Workshop's made, as at 45 points I did think they were basically auto include already. You get just a lot of wounds for your points there, even if they are easy to kill. It means they are a tough unit overall, either soaking up a lot of anti-infantry fire or being kind of hard to kill with anti-tank weapons. Getting 11 wounds for just 40 points is amazing. They're cheap enough to go and do secondary objectives and things, and put some in strategic reserves just to be annoyances. And of course they're pretty excellent for standing on any primary objectives as well, generating your command points while they're there. I think I'd just be very tempted to take 2 or 3 units in basically every Ork list at that kind of points cost. They're really not costing you all that much, and I feel like the opponent's going to spend more time and resources trying to kill those 30 Gretchen models than 120 points is really worth. Otherwise, very good boosts came to the Knobs and the Mega Knobs. The Knobs go down to 105 points from 115, and the Mega Knobs to 60 points from 65, both kind of similar percentage decreases there, and both of those were pretty efficient combat units in the first place that I think were pretty reasonable to field already. Probably a bit outcompeted by things like Beast Snagger Boys led by Beast Bosses, but I feel like with Beast Bosses being increased, they might well be the way to go now, as a unit of Knobs led by a War Boss looks like it's just very efficient for slots in a transport. Overall really solid value. The Orky Elite's definitely worth fielding in transports I think. Otherwise, for the more ranged odd boys, the Burner Boys drop down to 60 points from 65. I think that's definitely getting to the point where they're really quite interesting as well. They've got good Overwatch threats, and they can take chunks out of enemy infantry. Not going to be doing too much against heavies though. Looters are kind of hilariously down to the point where they're basically almost a horde infantry unit. 50 points for your standard Ork with a 5+ save, toughness 5, and at least a fairly big gun I think is fun. Despite being 10 points for basically an Ork with an auto cannon, they still probably need to be this cheap to really get selected, but I feel like they're pretty close to the break point where their defense isn't too bad for the cost, so any long range damage output that they can muster is a bit of a win. On the flip side though, Tank Busters were 135 and have dropped down to 110. That's the biggest points decrease relatively compared with the rest, but unfortunately that's still definitely not enough. They went from very awful to just awful. The fixed squad loadout and low defense per point is just too much at this stage still. Overall though, really quite positive changes to a bunch of units here. Gretchen remain amazing, Nobs and Mega Nobs are great, and Burners and Looters might get a bit more of a look in than they were getting before. For mounted units and artillery, Defcopters and Warbikes both got some reasonable points decreases. 100 points for 3 Defcopters now, 70 points for 3 Warbikes. I think both of those are good balance changes on Games Workshop's parts. I would have rated both of them a little bit underwhelming before, and that makes them a lot more palatable. Still going to be facing very stiff competition from the Squighog boys, which maybe do a little bit more damage to heavies with their Beast Snagger type rules, though I guess Warbikers did have their leader options go down as well. That's another win for them, I suppose. For perhaps one of the most unfortunate changes of the index, the Mech Guns have gone up from 45 points to 55. That's really quite a whopping percentage increase at plus 22% there. Really quite a rough change, as they were one of the few truly good firepower units that Orks got, and they've just got nerfed hard. Not entirely sure why these went up. I thought that they were solid enough, but not overpowered. I still think they're not going to be terrible to have maybe 1 or 2 kicking around in the deployment zone, but this definitely does massively hurt their efficiency, and perhaps further locks them into only wanting to take the custom mega cannons, which outcompete the rest of the loadouts by quite a bit, I think. Moving on to the other vehicle units, the truck has gone up from 50 points to 60 points. I feel like that's maybe not the worst nerf in the world. It did seem just a little bit surprisingly low costed before in the index. I'd rate that as probably a change from standout great to just very good. They're still going to be absolutely usable, though that is going to be a tax on a fair few Ork competitive lists at the moment that often tended to run multiple. I guess it might do just a little bit to offset some of their cargo if they were transporting things like Nobs or Mega Nobs around. The increase on the cost of the truck might compensate for the points saved. Otherwise, a few walkers went down a bit. Def Dreads dropped from 150 to 130, which I think is a nice change. I feel like a lot of people were quite excited by their beefy stats that they got, only to be disappointed by just how much they went up. I think that's a points cost where you're not going to regret putting them on the table anywhere near as much, but probably a little bit too high to keep them out of competitive lists for the most part as well. The Gorkanaut and Morkanaut both got very small points decreases relatively, not really going to change too much for them. I still think that the Gorkanaut is probably the better of the two with its bigger melee and the Deathstorm shooter. Kind of a shame it can't Overwatch anymore though. The Kill Rigs and Hunter Rigs both dropped down by around about 10% or so. Again, this one seems like a pretty reasonable balance change, as they weren't getting too much of a look in compared with things like trucks. Makes them both really quite a lot more credible options. I think I'd still be more tempted by the Kill Rig overall out of the two, given the Whir Tower though. Otherwise, I feel like Games Workshop really could have afforded to go really quite a lot harder with a lot of the other Orky motor pool though. The Orky flyers, like the Blitzer Bomber and the Burner Bomber, are perhaps some of the worst units in the Ork index, and they were left completely untouched. Their rules would be kind of bad if their points cost were significantly less than they are, but they're both quite expensive and also really bad for damage output due to the way that flyers work and bombs work these days. To be honest, probably points costs aren't really the fix to that. It's something to do with Games Workshop's flyer rules, or something rewritten on the datasheet that would need to change there, I suppose. It does seem a little bit with this update and the neglect of points changes for flyers that Games Workshop just doesn't really seem to be too keen on actually trying to make them relevant. Another perhaps slightly sad oversight were the October buggies, things like the Megatrack Scrapjet and the Shock Jump Dragster. Those are currently pretty much universally considered to be pretty underwhelming in Speedwire at the moment. Again, I think that partly just comes from them not having access to a themed Orky detachment that gives them some DACA benefits. It's all just about the melee and not about the speed and the shooting. But given that it's going to be quite a while till the Ork Codex comes out, it's perhaps just a bit of a shame to see them languishing as just being very unplayed, besides more casually until then. I think a few 5-point or 10-point buffs would probably have been in order there. Otherwise, killer cans remain pretty much the same. The Stomper gets absolutely no help, but that's kind of normal for Ork players, and that's just Games Workshop's usual way of doing things. Finally, there were perhaps surprisingly extensive changes to the Ork character section. This was a bit more sweeping than the vast majority of other factions got, at least besides the ones that were really struggling in the game, with pretty much the vast majority of characters going down, bar the really good ones like beast bosses on Squigosaurs and things. There was just one nerf to the flip side, with the standard beast boss going up from 80 points to 100, a big plus 25% nerf there. I think Games Workshop did that just because they were quite so common in competitive lists. It did seem to be the optimal Orky assault unit to have a beast boss with a big unit of beast snagger boys jumping out of trucks. I feel like the fact that they were getting played in quite so many lists really has driven that nerf there. Still though, it does feel kind of weird that they went up by quite so much when the regular war boss went down. which I think he was maybe a tiny bit worse than the Beast Boss on foot, though not crazily so. Now he's 65 points and the Beast Boss is 100, the difference in efficiency is just kind of ridiculous. Overall, definitely good news for standard war bosses. The regular one's 65, the bike boss is 75 from 85, and the war boss and mega armor drops down to 80 from 95. Kind of nice that he gets a proportionally bigger points decrease, as he wasn't taken very much previously. The Pain Boys have all had pretty reasonable decreases as well, again kind of niche characters given their feel no pain type buffs. Still probably not super exciting, but if you want one then they're a lot more efficient than they were. Two of the mechs have gone down. The big mech in mega armor is now 85 points from 100. I feel like that's pretty fantastic news for the mega knobs that also went down themselves. I think it's a really strong choice between the extra durability for them plus resurrecting ones once they're slain. The Force Field mech is going to be another interesting durability choice, competing against the Pain Boys. A whole bunch of the special characters went down as well. Snickrot's just 85, and he was already sort of interesting. Zagstruck's just 90, so good news for his unit of Storm Boys there. And Captain Badrock I thought was already very nice when leading a unit of Flashgits. He's just 80 points now, so the unit of Flashgits with him in it has looked even better than it was. Otherwise, the Deathkiller Wartrike drops down to 80, so he's pretty similar to the cost of a minimum unit of Warbikes now. And the Knob on Smasher Squig drops down from 75 to 60. I already thought that he wasn't too terrible as a datasheet as it went. I think he's going to be a genuinely interesting upgrade for Squighog Boys for a little bit of extra melee muscle now. Overall, loads of points cuts here, perhaps surprisingly generous really. I feel like these kind of changes are probably going to incentivise Orks to go a bit more character heavy than they were previously. The drop on the War Boss is absolutely great. He's going to be awesome backed up by some regular boys or some knobs. I do like the change for the big mech and the mega armor. Captain Badrock's awesome, and the knob on the Smasher Squig is fun too. Finally, for Ork points changes, there were a few things for Forge World stuff. We already mentioned the War Boss on the War Bike, but they also had a couple of decreases for the Kill Tank and the Mecha Dread. They are quite small though, and they weren't taken loads before. It seems that a few of the other units that I genuinely think weren't too bad in terms of wounds and things put on the table, with the Gargantuan Squiggoth and the Grot tanks, both of those are fine. I guess the Gargantuan Squiggoth, being a towering but melee unit, actually gets some benefit out of the new towering rules. It might have half a chance to hide behind some terrain if there's some exceptionally big ruins. The one nerf from this section though was big tracks going up from 75 points to 90, and they were really quite a competitively relevant and often played unit in top tier lists, though kind of niche among Ork players more regularly. That is a similar sort of proportionate increase versus the trucks. I still feel like it probably lands them in a place where they're still kind of playable, but again they'll have lost some ground against other options like battle wagons or the kill rigs. Overall though, taking the changes as a whole, I feel like it's not come up too badly for the Orks, doing kind of alright before, which is more than you could say for a lot of armies, and really quite a lot of good points cuts, some of them which did hit competitively relevant units, maybe Gretchins and standard war bosses being some of the best recipients of those. I think we'll definitely be seeing a lot more knobs and mega knobs riding in transports towards the enemy, maybe with standard war bosses with the knobs or the mega mechs attached to the mega knobs, and just in general loads of characters got better. I feel like Squighog Boys, Squigosaur bosses, and knobs on Smasher Squigs will be quite fun as well. For the biggest losers, I feel like the mech guns and the beast bosses have both taken some really quite big hits. Kind of a shame to have competitively relevant units taken from being quite good to being a bit underwhelming for the cost. Big tracks will be seen a fair bit less. I suspect that trucks will still get played quite a bit though, given how cheap they are. And I guess I'd also rate the units that needed help but didn't get it as overall losers. Planes and buggies and some of the walkers that didn't drop enough being some of the most standout culprits. Overall though, I feel like it's not the worst time to be an Orky player. A bunch of underwhelming stuff did get buffed and is far more mid-tier as opposed to being downright bad, even if not everything got helped out at this stage. With so many of the top armies taking some very heavy blows, I feel like it seems that the Orks might be in a good place to catch up with them, perhaps being one of the armies to look out for in future 40k. Let me know your thoughts on the Orks though down in the comments below. Look forward to hearing what your takes are on these big sweeping points updates, and what units are you most looking forward to putting on the table now. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones most days, and I'll try and do some similar ones like this for a few of the other factions as well. I've already done ones for Guards, Space Marines, Necrons and Tyranids if you wanted to check those out. Otherwise, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well. That's my main way of keeping all these videos coming quite so regularly, so if you are enjoying a lot, then any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.